All right, so as I mentioned, I'm a social scientist, so I'm interested in relationships, what shapes our relationships with each other, and the implications of those relationships that we have. All right, so tonight I'm going to talk about the fact that we are social people, we're social beings, and these relationships are developed at an individual level, but they're also developed at the business level, at the country level, and at the regional level. So today we're going to talk about the research that I recently did on trade relationships among countries and what those trade relationships mean in terms of the riskiness of the world. So we are social beings, and Bhaskar mentioned that in the post-war period, I think there was significant trauma that came out of the First and Second World War, and the response of different countries in the world was to integrate and to establish relationships with each other in order to reduce that risk. Because nobody in the post-war period wanted war to happen again because it was such a traumatic period. So integration is essentially, or can be viewed as a risk reduction strategy. And over the past 70 years or so, there have been very different models of integration that have emerged in the world. And I'm going to use as my examples tonight the ASEAN region in Southeast Asia versus the European Union. So we have about 4 or 5 different models of integration, different ways in which countries have pledged to develop closer connections with each other. So the first model is a free trade area where you reduce essentially tariffs in trade. A customs union is essentially, for example, if the 4 of us are different countries, we then agree to have tariff-free trade amongst us, but we also agree on a single tariff if we decide to import products from you. So it doesn't matter whether your products enter whichever country, the tariff is essentially the same. That's a customs union. And then we have a common market where countries agree to have free movement of goods, services, capital, and people across different countries. Economic union usually includes agreement on a single currency, and in the entire world, only the European Union really has one single currency. And finally, the deepest form of integration of them all is a total or fully economically integrated region where there isn't just economic convergence, but agreement on policy with respect to defense, social development, etc. So these are the 6 different models of integration that have been used in the post-war period to reduce risk in the world. So the way to reduce risk is to get more connected with each other. Now, if we use the ASEAN region and the European Union as examples, we can view these 2 models as belonging to 2 extreme ends of this spectrum. So on the one end of the spectrum to the right, we have the European Union, which was established in 1957 right away as a customs union. They skipped the free trade model and went straight to establishing a customs union. At that particular point in time, they already agreed that they would already start moving towards total economic integration. They formed a single market with the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, established the euro, which essentially paved the way to full economic integration in 1999. So Europe is the most integrated region in the world. By contrast, the ASEAN region is a very different story. It was established in 1967, and I've been very cheeky with my arrow here. I deliberately made the arrow just half an arrow, and it doesn't even point to free trade area, because in 1967, the 6 founding members of ASEAN essentially agreed to, hold hands and sing Kumbaya and say, we're all going to be friends. That's what they did in 1967. They didn't even agree to form a free trade area. It was just a pact of friendship. They became officially a free trade area many years later, in 1992, when they formed the ASEAN Free Trade Area. And then eventually in 2015 began to move towards a limited common market by forming the ASEAN Economic Cooperation in 2015. So the 2 models of integration are very different. So the ASEAN region is composed of small economies. It's a very non-interventionist kind of relationship. And the whole motivation, the whole risk management motivation is, together we're individually small, but together we are strong. And by virtue of that, then we are less exposed to risk, because together we are strong. This is very different when we compare that to the European Union, which is composed largely of large economies. They're very large economies, and they're very institutions-driven. They established the European Commission, the European Central Bank, the European Court of Justice, and everything is, managed from the top. And all of these supranational, regional institutions, keep everyone in line and make sure that they follow the rules. It's a very institutions-driven kind of model. The motivation of the European Union was very different from the ASEAN region, because the motivation was to prevent war from happening again. So the European countries were, let's just imagine the post-war period, in 1945, everyone was fresh from being in a situation where they had neighboring countries invade them. And so they said, no, this can never happen again. And that's why they said, let's tie our fortunes together so that we can all become peaceful and prosperous together. Prior to the establishment of the European Economic Community, there was a predecessor to that, and that was the European Coal and Steel Community. And at that particular point in time, why coal and why steel? Because clearly these were 2 important ingredients for building economic infrastructure required for growth. But I think people also forget that coal and steel are also very important ingredients to wage war. So Europe wanted to control the movement of coal and steel so that, they would get a better sense of whether there was one country that was intending to wage war again. So Europe was driven by motivations of peace and prosperity, and they're mainly large economies. So the first proposition here is that regional integration is a risk reduction mechanism. Whether we're looking at small economies that band together for strength, or large economies that band together to achieve peace and prosperity. So that was all great for 50 or 70 years. But the question was, have we achieved complete risk reduction? Can we say that the world today is less risky than it was in the post-war period? Now this particular question is pretty much, it's an under-researched question in the scholarly literature, because nobody really knows, because it's really only at this point in time when we have access to good empirical data that we can analyze to determine the actual impact of integration on the world. So this particular paper looks at the impact of integration on risk and tries to answer two questions. The first question is, what is the impact of the type of regional integration, whether it's a free trade agreement or a customs union or a fully integrated model? What is the impact of regional integration models on the kinds of relationships that emerge as a result of putting that model in place? Okay. What's the impact on relationship networks? So as a social scientist, my favorite lens is the social network lens. So I'm going to use a social network lens. I've used a social network lens to analyze the impact of different types of regional integrations on the structure of economic relationships that have emerged over time. And then this paper asks a second question. Given the nature and the structure of relationships that have emerged, what is the impact on risk? Is the world less risky today, or is it more risky than it was 70 years ago? So these are the two questions that we're going to answer tonight. So the first question is, what is the impact of the regional integration models on the structure of trade relationships that have emerged in that particular region? So this paper compares ASEAN versus the European Union. So let's look at the ASEAN region, which is governed mainly by a free trade agreement, versus the European Union, which is governed by a fully integrated regional model, and compare the connectedness of both. Let's look at the Southeast Asia. By the way, the period that I did this study was between 1990 to 2014. So I looked at how the structure of international trade relationships grew and formed from 1990 to 2014, and looked at the structure of these relationships in Southeast Asia versus the structure in the European Union. All right. What did I use to construct the network, the picture, essentially? What did I use to draw the networks? So when we do network analysis, the countries are nodes, and any kind of export or import, commodity trade, export or import, is a line that connects two countries. So there's a line there's a line between two countries if there is an export or an import relationship. So this study only looks at commodity trade. It doesn't look at services trade. All right. What did the ASEAN trade network look like in 1990? Are you ready? The ASEAN trade network looked like this in 1990. These were the 10 ASEAN countries in 1990. And if we were to draw a network connecting trade imports and exports among different countries in the ASEAN region, this is what the network would look like. 10 years down the track, what did this trade network look like? Of course, relationships change over time, right? So in the year 2000, what did the ASEAN network look like? This is how the ASEAN network looked like in the year 2000. So clearly, there was much greater connectedness in the region by the year 2000. In 2012, how did the network look like? The network looked like that, which was even denser. It was a much denser network in 2012. So that's great. So this is how the relationships within and among the ASEAN countries developed over time within the framework of a free trade agreement. But what about the European Union? The European Union, as we know, is a very different story. In 1957, as a region, it agreed that it would become a fully integrated region down the track. So what did the European Union trade network look like in 1990? Are you ready? In 1990, this is how the European Union trade network looked like. So remember that the Maastricht Treaty, the Single Market Treaty, was signed in 1993. So prior to 1990, the network was already pretty dense within the region. Yes? An export or an imported product. Yeah, thank you. 10 years down the line, what did the European Union trade network look like? The European Union trade network was so dense that when I generated the image, it was a blacked out image. This basically means that this is a perfect network. A perfect network is essentially one where every single country is connected to every single country in the network. It's a perfectly connected network. And this was in 2000, soon after the introduction of the euro. So the euro's introduction was fully completed in 1999. And so this was a year after the euro became the single currency in the Union. And of course, in the year 2012, it's essentially the same. It's a perfectly connected network. So the question that I'm more interested in, because I specialize in risk and risk management, is what does this connectedness mean from the perspective of risk? Is the ASEAN region, which is a dense but not fully connected network, is that a less risky region compared to a region which is fully connected? What are the implications on risk? What's the implication of increased connectedness on risk? Before we go into that, let me just summarize the insights. So the insights here for the first question is the type of regional integration. The type of the regional integration agreement matters. So free trade agreements, which are essentially just cooperative agreements, result in moderately connected or loosely coupled networks. So what do I mean when I say first generation free trade agreements? A first generation free trade agreement just focuses on the removal of tariffs among countries. Second generation free trade agreements focus on the removal of tariffs as well as non-tariff barriers, whereas third generation free trade agreements, which are pretty new, similar to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and the agreement that Australia is looking at now. It's an agreement between Indonesia and Australia. Those agreements are third generation free trade agreements, which are very different because it includes alignment of policy as well as removal of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So cooperative agreements result in moderately connected and loosely coupled networks, whereas deep integration agreements like the European Union result in densely connected and very tightly coupled networks. And the further analysis of the data will show that even before a country completes its accession to the European Union, the trade with that country already increases even before its accession to the Union. All right. What are the implications on risk? Is ASEAN a riskier region compared to the EU, or is the EU a riskier region compared to ASEAN? So the way that we evaluate riskiness is I look at the structure of the network and I look at network vulnerability. So if we arrange the countries in the network according to countries that are most connected, so degrees are essentially connections, most connected country to least connected country. So if we arrange countries according to connectedness, and if that arrangement of most connected country to least connected country results in a curve like this is called a power law curve. This means that the entire network structure is heavily dependent on the most connected country. So if the most connected country collapses, then it brings the entire network down with it, which makes sense, right? So if we remove the most connected country in a distribution that resembles a power law, then the entire network structure essentially disintegrates. It's like Google, right? Google is the most connected, one of the most connected websites on the World Wide Web. If Google collapses, then we're all sad because a lot of the other connected websites are also going to collapse. So, any questions before we move on? All right. Give me a minute.
Can we do questions later?
Okay.
Let's go for the time.
All right. Okay. So, sorry, sir. So we'll do questions later. So, an example let me give an example. If, for example, in Central Asia, in continental Asia, the three most connected countries, and this is a related paper that I did recently, the three most connected countries are India, Pakistan, and China. Most connected in terms of trade in continental Asia. That means if anything happens to India, it's going to bring the entire trade network down with it. And it's the same thing is going to happen. If China's economy happens to collapse, then everything that's connected to China is also going to collapse. So that's what dependence on the most connected country means. So what does the distribution in the ASEAN region look like? So this is the ASEAN region over time. So this is the power law curve of the ASEAN countries in 1990. So if we were to arrange the ASEAN countries from the most connected country to the least connected country in 1990, this is the kind of curve that we get. Looking back, we see that the curve is pretty pronounced. So the conclusion here is that in 1990, the ASEAN region was pretty dependent on the most connected country at that time. If the economy of that most connected country had collapsed or had experienced a shock, then the entire network is going to experience a shock. But if in 1990 this less connected economy would experience a shock, then that means the rest of the network wouldn't feel anything because it's not as connected as this most connected country. So just looking at the shape of the curves over time, so this is 1990, this is 2000, and this is 2014, we find that the curve has become less pronounced and it's become flatter. Okay, so that means that the ASEAN region has become less dependent on the most connected country over time, simply because all the other countries have increased their connections with each other. So for those of you who are interested, these are the most connected countries. These were the most connected countries in 1990, 2002, and 2014. If Singapore had collapsed or had experienced a major shock in the 1990s, then the entire region would have experienced a shock. Note that in 1990, Thailand was the third most connected country in the region, which I think partly explains why the Asian financial crisis in 1996, 1997 started in Thailand and spread throughout the rest of the region. Fast forward to 2014, Thailand has been able to pick itself up in the region, and in 2014 now leads the pack in terms of connectedness. So while Thailand is a pretty connected country, the region is less dependent on, still dependent on Thailand, but less so compared to how dependent it was in 1990 on Singapore. So what about the European Union? The European Union is very different. So we know that it was extremely connected already in 1990 and became even more connected, a fully connected network by 2000 and 2014. So in 1990, the European Union was still pretty dependent on, vulnerable to the most connected country, because you can still see the curve. But towards 2002 and 2014, then the curve is really flat. Its curve is really flat. That means that although Germany, Italy, and France lead the connectedness in the region, the European Union really isn't vulnerable too much on the collapse of any of the most connected country. But if we look at it really, really closely, and the next three graphs are going to compare ASEAN versus EU. So this is 1990. We can see that the ASEAN curve is very pronounced compared to the EU curve. In 2002, we still have a pretty pronounced ASEAN curve, but a much flatter European Union curve. And 2014, really pretty much flat. And the ASEAN region is still pretty curved. So in the paper, what does this mean in terms of risk? Because the ASEAN region is still very vulnerable to the collapse of the most connected country in the region, the nature of that risk exposure is, I'm referring to it as concentrated risk. So in other words, the entire risk exposure of the ASEAN region is concentrated on the most connected country, which is very different in the case of the European Union, because in the European Union, everyone's connected to each other, and they're pretty much connected at the same level of connectedness. What does that mean? That means that the vulnerability of the region is random. Any one of these countries in the European Union can collapse or experience a shock. And the shock is going to spread out very, very quickly throughout the rest of the European Union. And we find evidence of this actually as far back as the Greek debt crisis. Greece is not a major economy in the European Union. It's, I think, somewhere towards the lower end of the spectrum in terms of economic size. But as soon as Greece experienced a debt crisis, and there was a significant threat that Greece would exit the Union in 2009, everyone went into panic mode, and everyone then eventually decided to save Greece. And so this whole concept of random risk, which essentially means that the entire all the European Union countries are exposed or vulnerable to each other, because we know this makes me really upset at this whole Brexit business, because it doesn't matter that the United Kingdom is no longer, the most connected country in the European Union. All it matters is that the European Union at this particular point in time is so connected that any single country in the Union is exposed to every other country in the Union. It's a very vulnerable place, in fact. So that's what I refer to as random risk. So this is now where we get to the paradox of risk. So in the post-war period, the world essentially decided to connect with each other to reduce risk. So in the case of the ASEAN region, the risk management motivation was together we are strong. Unfortunately, we are vulnerable to the biggest and most connected member country in the region. In the case of the European Union, the motivation was let's all connect with each other because together we are peaceful and prosperous. Unfortunately, we are vulnerable to each other, even to the smallest and the weakest economy. The European Union is only as strong as its weakest link, essentially. So from a risk management perspective, to just summarize, because we're all social beings, we connect with each other to reduce risk. Unfortunately, risk isn't eliminated. It just transforms. It transforms into one thing from another. And the way in which we choose to connect determines our risk exposure. At this point in time, because this is an international strategic studies think tank, I'm going to throw into the mix a flag. A big flag that we need to really keep an eye on is the Belt and Road Initiative of China. Because the Belt and Road Initiative of China is a very different model of integration which doesn't fit into any of the models that we discussed today. That's a totally different, it's practically another seminar for me to talk about that. But that particular model of integration brings with it all sorts of different risks, including credit risk and geopolitical risk, which is different, completely different kettle of fish. So that relates to my fourth point here. The way in which we choose to connect determines our risk exposure. Loosely coupled connections give rise to concentrated risk because we're only vulnerable to the biggest and most connected country. Tightly coupled connections give rise to random risk. And I'm hopping on a plane later tonight, and I think one example that I can think of that's a really good example of a tightly coupled connection is being on a plane with 200 other people. That's a pretty tightly connected network, and it doesn't matter whether a person who has a cold sits in business class or whether the person with a cold sits at the back of the plane. It doesn't matter. Everyone gets sick. This is the problem with tightly coupled connections. As we become increasingly connected in the world, we become increasingly vulnerable to each other. And therefore, our risk management strategies need to take a much broader approach. This means that if we want to reduce risks for our country, we need to also ensure that we incorporate risk reduction for everybody, simply because we are all connected. And in closing, I'd like to share that when I walked into the office this afternoon, I saw the poster with a quote from John Muir that said that if we tug on one thing in nature, we find that everything is connected. And this is what this whole paper is all about. We are all connected. For those of us who want to read the full paper, the paper is published in the World Economy, and I'm pretty sure you can access it online. Thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you.